Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. In this episode, we will discuss what the Trump administration's fiscal year 2026 budget means for AI policy. We'll talk about the future of AI Diffusion Framework, and we'll talk about the CCP Politburo study session on AI. We have with us Greg Allen, who's the director of our Wadhwani AI Center. Greg, welcome. Great to see you.
Great to be here with you, as always.
Great to be back. Let's talk about the Trump administration's skinny budget. It's so-called skinny because it is what? Tell us why it's skinny.
Yeah, so if you think about what it means that the president has submitted their budget, right? That formidable thing that happens in Washington, D.C. every year. That is a mountain of phone book thick PDF documents that detail every program at every department of every agency and how much money the president thinks they should get in that year's budget. So this proposal is not that. Instead of being thousands and thousands of pages going down to the program level, this so-called skinny budget does give the top line budget request for every single agency. It does at times go to the level of departments and bureaus and specific, program initiatives that the Trump administration thinks are important enough to include in this proposal. But this was a 46-page document, so a considerably smaller undertaking than the traditional budget request. I think it's worth noting, right, that this is the first year of the administration, and there was a gap between the second administration and the first administration. So it's pretty familiar to Washington, D.C. For a first-year president to take longer than usual to submit the budget request. I think statutorily, the budget request is due in either February or March. Here we are in May, and not only do we not have the full budget request, but the thing that we've got, is this skinny budget request, which still leaves some unanswered questions. But it is really important. It does give, Congress the opportunity to chew on certain kinds of issues. And it does include some really important news. I mean, you learn so much about a president's priorities when they say, give more money to this, give less money to that. And while there has been stuff coming out of the Trump administration that is funding relevant, such as some guidance from the Office of Management and Budget that came out previously, this is the most authoritative thing that we've gotten to date on the statement of the Trump administration priorities. And that includes a lot on AI, which shows up in this document repeatedly.
Greg, so let's talk about what areas of the federal government's AI ecosystem that this budget is going to impact. To start, what did this budget reveal about the administration's approach to export control enforcement?
Okay, so I'm gonna sound like an arrogant jerk here, but I kind of have to. I have to. I'm sorry. I don't have the emotional strength to restrain myself. I got to take a victory lap here. I have been screaming, at the Biden administration, at the Trump administration, at everyone that, they've been pursuing an aggressive export control strategy. That's the politics of the situation, but then there's also the government capacity of the situation, right? Are you actually arming the relevant departments of the government with the resources and capacity that they need to execute this strategy? And so that's why and the Biden administration, which really leaned heavily on export controls for both the Russia part of the story, ensuring that sanctions and export controls against Russia had adequate enforcement, and then also the China part of the story, mostly an AI story and an advanced technology story. The Biden administration didn't start requesting more money for BIS until pretty late in the administration, and they never successfully got it through Congress. So here we have the Trump administration saying in their first budget document that they want, quote, that the budget, quote, includes $134 million in targeted investments to strengthen trade enforcement and aggressively protect American innovation. This includes an additional $122 million for the Bureau of Industry and Security, a more than 50% increase to protect the nation's technological competitiveness and counter threats from China. So this is really backing up what Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick said in his original congressional confirmation testimony, where he said that BIS was the, quote, intellectual front line against relentless threat from the People's Republic of China. But people like me were concerned when you see those statements out of Lutnick in the confirmation hearing, and then that was followed by, on March 24th, OMB Director Russell Vought sending a letter to Congress that he was going to freeze $20 million in emergency funding appropriated by Congress into BIS. So it seemed like there was a mismatch between words and actions when that Vought thing comes out. But now that we have greater clarity on the story based on this skinny budget, I think we can safely assume that the Vought cuts were more of the sort of traditional salami slicing. I'm just going to say no, or I'm going to reduce on a pretty broad basis in a way that doesn't necessarily tell you about my nitty-gritty feelings on every single issue. And now that the Trump administration and the interagency process that the White House leads has sort of done a review of strategic priorities, it's clear that effective export control enforcement is on those priorities, as reflected in the fact that it shows up in the budget. And I think this is really important because, we had he was then the undersecretary in charge of the Bureau of Industry and Security, and therefore in charge of dual-use export controls. We had him at CSIS last year. This was the exit interview with the Biden administration official. And he basically said that their licensing workload, their enforcement workload had doubled over the past 10 years, and their budget was flat or declining in inflation-adjusted terms. So imagine if I said to you, Andrew, hey, great news, we got some growth opportunities for you, so here's twice as much work to do, and no, we're not going to create any more hours. No, we're not going to give you any more staff. And no, we're not going to give you any more money. I mean, that'd be really daunting as a challenge.
I hate that.
Yes. And this is the first time that I think BIS is really being treated the right way. Now, there's a question, and a very real question, which is, how much of this is too little, too late? A lot of smuggling has already taken place. A lot of stuff has been shipped to China. I would have loved to have seen something like this happen in the first Trump administration or in the Biden administration, but I've been calling for it. I literally wrote a paper saying that this was the highest return on investment opportunity available anywhere in national security. I published that in December 2022 through CSIS right after I got here. And then I also testified to that score before Congress a few weeks ago. So hence I have to take my victory lap. This is finally
and we did
happening,
several
and I'm
podcasts
gratified.
on this issue too.
Totally.
So this office now is going to be adequately funded, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, this certainly looks a lot closer to adequate. We'll kind of have to see. I should also mention here that, there's smart ways to spend money and there's dumb ways to spend money. So we don't know, because it is a skinny budget, we don't really know the nitty gritty of what that additional $122 million is actually going to be used to do. But if you look at the people who the Trump administration installed as being in charge of export controls, I love all the signals that I've been receiving.
Good to know. Let's talk about basic research. What did we learn about the administration's views on federal spending for basic AI research?
Yeah, and so this is something where, there's the broader climate for funding of academic, scientific, and engineering research. And that's something that a lot of folks have expressed concern about when it comes to the Trump administration's approach. They're cutting funding for certain types of universities. They're cutting funding for medical research. Obviously, when you think about scientists, they love the grants that the federal government makes, to support that research. And so here, the National Science Foundation, along with the National Institutes of Health, those are kind of and the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, those are kind of like the big four of federal sources of research. And NSF in particular has a massive AI portfolio. Well, the budget request says that they want to cut NSF funding by 50%. So that is a huge, huge cut. But there's this quote in there that is pretty remarkable. It says, quote, funding for artificial intelligence is maintained at current levels. So that basically says everybody in the NSF, well, maybe not everybody, but almost everybody in the NSF is getting a cut in terms of research domains, whether that's biology, whether that's material science, so on and so forth. But AI funding is maintained at current levels. So I think that speaks to just how important the Trump administration sees AI funding. And if you think about,
let me stop you there for a second. So if they see it as important and they're going to keep it at current levels, why wouldn't they increase it?
Well, I think it's I think it's just the overall desire to target cuts. I think that's fair. And then maybe what I've heard from Republican colleagues is they'll say something like, well, what is the appropriate balance of what should be federal funding for research and development when it comes to AI versus what should be private sector funding for research and AI. And I guess what they've concluded, and some of this relates to interagency politics, some of this relates to congressional politics, and what the White House thinks is the right way to sort of thread those political needles. One thing that I think is important here is that if you go to, an OpenAI or an Anthropic or a Google and you talk to these people, you ask them like, hey, are you receiving NSF money right now? The answer is almost always no, at these big tech companies. But if you ask them who funded the grant that funded your grad school, the answer is much, much more likely to be NSF. And so, NSF is really more important upstream in the funding process, getting early stage research that can lead to those kind of like more risky kind of ideas that then the private sector can harvest both the talent that research funded the creation of, and then also the research innovations that created. So that's kind of what we're seeing from NSF. But there's other agencies, that are part of this story that are also part of AI. I mentioned DOE a minute ago. Well, the budget is going to include $1.1 billion less for the Department of Energy's Office of Science. But here again, quote, the budget maintains U.S. competitiveness in priority areas such as high-performance computing, artificial intelligence, quantum information science, fusion, and critical minerals. So here, the Trump administration is really picking winners when they think about like what technologies they think are important to national competitiveness. And again, AI is identified.
So in your view, though, is it enough to keep this funding at current levels? I mean, it seems to me the point of this podcast and the point of a lot of national security these days is centered around AI policy. And, I could understand cutting lots of other things. This seems to me to be something that we need to really invest in. I wonder what your views are.
So I think just the fact that everyone else is getting a decrease and this is being held flat, that is a pretty strong signal of relative prioritization. What your question is getting to is absolute prioritization. And I think you could make an argument, right, that we really need to be putting more money into this. One thing that I wouldn't be surprised to see is, and this is a very classic, like bureaucratic knife fighting kind of a tactic, is a lot of projects that are worried about their money are suddenly discovering that, in fact, actually, when you really think about it, we're an AI project. And so they're going to go start competing for those dollars in within their own departments, within their own bureaus.
But Greg, I wonder in the larger picture, aren't we in an arms race with China and others on AI, specifically, though, with China? And so I'm trying to get to like, okay, where's the increase here? How do we win?
Yeah, I think you're totally right to point this out, and I don't have the number in front of me. But if you go back to 2017 and compare it to today, 2017 is when China released their national AI strategy. The amount of funding available for basic research and everything, but especially in AI, has exploded in China. And it's gone up in the United States over that same period of time, but it hasn't exploded. And I do think that is, kind of a concerning question, especially when you think about, do we actually have the seed corn for the next generation of AI scientists? I mentioned how important these, grants are in developing the talent pipeline. Well, the private sector is actually the problem in some of these instances. There was a very famous incident a few years ago when Uber hired essentially half of the computer science department faculty at Carnegie Mellon University and brought them into the private sector. And the dean at the time, the dean of the School of Computer Science, said, hey, this is a real challenge. You ought to really be thinking about like the harm you're doing to the long-term pipeline of talent, for this country. But then the dean also went into the private sector not long after he made those remarks. And so if there's not, viable streams of funding going into the academic sector, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, who's going to train the next generation of great AI scientists? And that's an area where China, plenty of people have argued that they're eating our lunch. I mean, they're trying to basically say like, hey, maybe American universities are better so that, 50 out of every 100 students who come from American universities are stars, and only 20 out of every 100 students who come from Chinese universities are going to be stars. But we're going to produce 10 times as many students, and so we'll still have more stars overall. And they kind of think in those terms of competitiveness. There's one area where there is no protection for AI that I do think could end up being significant, and that is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The skinny budget document calls for a $325 million cut to NIST, but it did not detail, which areas of NIST would be more or less affected. So whether or not the AI Safety Institute, which is housed at NIST, is going to be a part of that $325 million cut, not specified at this time. And one could foresee a scenario where, in fact, this is the sort of moment in which it does result in that. I guess one thing worth pointing out here, right, is that all of this still is going to go to Congress. The budget request is a request. And obviously, this White House has a lot of influence over this Congress.
But ultimately, Congress has the power of the purse strings.
That's right, and they usually want to put their stamp on a budget, even when the president is very popular. It's pretty common for Congress, so it not yet able to see where this is going to go.
And the president's popular in the Republican caucus, but he's not so popular elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in this Congress. So to that point, let's talk about another agency, DoD. This is your baby. What about the administration's AI defense priorities? We know how much AI is on the battlefield in Ukraine, for instance. To what extent did the budget address the administration's AI defense priorities?
Yeah, rather remarkably, there's no explicit call out for AI here. Right. So
that is remarkable.
Yeah. So DoD is an important funder of the kinds of early stage R&D AI that we were talking about before. DARPA, a lot of their grants look vaguely similar to the type of grants that you would see come at NSF. Of course, there's more of like a defense, style focus, but they do that kind of early stage research grant making. And there's a bunch of other parts of the DoD that do the exact same thing. But DoD, unlike NSF, also has this big applied research and development portfolio, right? We're not trying to make some kind of research breakthrough in fundamental science. We're trying to get this autonomous aircraft to work. So while there's no statement here explicitly, right, that like AI and autonomy are the priorities, we've gotten that from other statements coming out of this administration. So, for example, when Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, put out a call for big cuts, he listed a series of programs and priorities that were to be protected, and AI and autonomous systems were on that list before. So even though AI wasn't called out explicitly in the skinny budget request, my expectation is that that mindset is still a part of what's going on at the DoD. But we won't know that for sure until we start getting those, 1,000-page documents, or until we see what's coming out of Congress. And here I think it's worth pointing out that in addition to what's going on in the White House, there's also what's going on in Congress. The most noteworthy part of it is this reconciliation package. So exercising the reconciliation process, which is one of the ways that you can get a budget to pass Congress without relying on the filibuster, which is really important and influential right in this time frame. And so in late April, House and Senate Republicans proposed, a reconciliation package that did have $150 billion in supplemental funding from DoD, and that did talk about applications of AI and autonomy to naval shipbuilding, one-way attack unmanned aircraft. I mean, these are kind of like terms that if you're in the know, these are priority use cases for AI in the defense market ecosystem. One final thing here is there's a little bit of a scuffle going on between the Office of Management Budget and Republicans in Congress as to whether or not, the Trump administration's top line pretty significant increase for the Department of Defense includes, the plus up that Congress is proposing as part of this reconciliation package. So just how much additional money is going to be flowing into the DoD, how much of that is going to go into AI, unclear. But I do think it's worth pointing out that we've seen a signal from House and Senate, and we've seen a signal from the White House, and both of them are basically saying we want to see a lot more AI and autonomy in this effort.
Well, I know you're going to be writing about this and talking about this a lot, so we'll come back to this topic. But this is interesting. I want to move on to the future of AI Diffusion Framework. Trump administration officials are currently considering the future of the Biden era AI Diffusion Framework, which is due to go into effect in a couple weeks, May 15th. Before we dive into the future of this framework, can you remind the audience of what the stakes are of this policy, what this policy actually is?
Yeah, so this policy is remarkable in so many ways. I mean, I described it in our podcast way back when it came out in January 13th, 2025. So, like right before Biden goes out the door, as kind of the break in case of emergency policy when it comes to export controls on AI chips. And in this regard, it segments the entire world into 3 tiers of countries. Tier 1, where you can buy unlimited chips with basically no restrictions. Tier 2, where you can buy unlimited chips, but with real restrictions that basically mean, we need to have some confidence as to how you're going to use those chips if you buy them. And you can buy unlimited chips in theory, but you can't buy unlimited chips if you're going to use them in certain kinds of ways, et cetera, which I can get into more in a moment. And then Tier 3, which is like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a bunch of others, which is basically like, no, you can't have these chips under any kind of circumstances. So it has been a very unpopular policy internationally, sometimes because the policy is not especially well understood. I think in Europe, right, where it does not treat every member country of the EU identically, they're just going to be opposed to that on principle. But the reality is there's a lot of countries out there who think that Tier 2 means that they're basically in the same league as China or close to it in terms of not being able to buy a bunch of chips, when in reality, that's not really what the policy says. Nevertheless, right, this policy is exceptionally controversial. There's a lot of pressure coming from a bunch of different directions. There are strong supporters of the policy. One of the leading AI labs, Anthropic, just released a position paper on April 29th that came out, again, strongly in favor of the diffusion rule, though they did call for some modifications. And on the other side, you have companies like NVIDIA, which is basically saying, this policy is kryptonite to our business model, and whatever you think about this rule, we live in a different world from even the 4 months ago when it was passed. And so this has got to go. The reason why all of this is coming to a head is because when the Biden administration put this rule forward, they put it as an interim final rule, which means it takes effect unless the Trump administration stops it. So the Trump administration basically has 3 options. One is kill the rule, one is go forward with the rule with no changes, and then the other is go forward with the rule with changes. And I suppose they also have a 4th option here, which is to punt, basically say, we are delaying the implementation of the rule by an additional 90 days or whatever while we, commence further study. I think the most popular opinion in the White House and in Trump agencies at this moment is that they want to implement this rule with modifications. One of the things that I think the Trump administration is, of course, interested in is, as all of these trade and tariff negotiations are going around the world, I think they're interested in leverage. And so one question is, can you make it clearer that the terms of the diffusion rule are negotiable for all of these countries, right? If you do X, Y, and Z, then this other thing will happen that might be desirable to sort of throw out there as a carrot or a stick in trade negotiations. So the Trump administration has the opportunity to put its stamp on the diffusion rule. The question is, are they ready to do that, right? They've been in office for 4 months now. But, a lot of their people weren't appointed, including people who hold offices in some of the key positions until not that long ago. Like Mike Kratsios, for example, director of the White House Office of Science Technology Policy, he hasn't been in the seat that long. The folks in BIS have not been in the seat that long. And it's hard to write these rules. I mean, in one of my podcasts interviews, a while back, I actually pulled out like a Biden administration export control and just dropped the paper on the table and let everybody hear the thud that these 300-page regulations make when they hit. And so the question is, Do they actually have a modified diffusion rule that has made it through the interagency process? That's really hard. So I'm gonna maybe put my foot in my mouth here and say that if I had to guess what's going to happen, they're going to announce some changes and then also announce, a 90-day delay or something else to give them additional opportunities to change. Now,
okay, so I mean that was my question.
yeah.
Ultimately, what do you expect the Trump administration to go for in this AI diffusion framework?
Yeah, and what I just said, I don't have especially high confidence in what I just said, so I wouldn't be super surprised if I was wrong. But they're getting, there's a lot of different things in play. There are Republicans who are loudly in opposition to this, for example, in the Senate. Although, as I look at the list of the folks who wrote a letter on April 14th to Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick asking him to abandon the diffusion rule, the diffusion framework, notably, Ted Cruz was not on that list. And Senator Ted Cruz of Texas had previously been a pretty staunch opponent of this. And so I think it's kind of interesting that I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but it could be that, there are some pockets of resistance that are actually weakening when it comes to the diffusion rule. And if that is indeed the case, then you could see the sort of path forward that I've described here, right? Which is they still want to put the Trump administration stamp on it, but some form of the diffusion rule is happening. One final thing I think that's really worth mentioning here is that there is a trip to the Middle East coming up for this White
next
House.
week.
And it is very coincidentally timed with the ultimate implementation of the diffusion rule. So there are folks in the Middle East who do not like the diffusion rule. Saudi Arabia is certainly among them. If you talk to folks in the former Biden administration, I think what they would sort of say is the diffusion rule takes the underlying logic of the US UAE AI chip deal and makes that more broadly applicable on some, a universal basis with some common principles. But I think people in the UAE are still frustrated that they're not getting all of the chips that they want all of the time. And so the fact that Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, UAE's national security advisor and the brother of the president, visited Washington, D.C. in March, I guarantee you AI chips and the diffusion rule and export controls were a part of that conversation. The fact that we've got this upcoming speech in the Middle East, this visit to the UAE, I'm sure all of this is coming to a head. So even though the diffusion rule doesn't actually go into effect until later, I feel pretty confident that we're going to learn something important about the future of export controls to non-Chinese countries next week during this speech.
Greg, I want to finally today talk about the Chinese Politburo, which held an April study session on AI. Before we get into what was discussed, why should we care about this meeting in the first place?
Yeah, so a study session is, a canonical calendar kind of event in the Chinese political system. That's where Xi Jinping or whoever's the chairman at the time sort of says, hey, I want all of my top people to spend time listening to top experts and discussing this critical issue. There was, an AI one in the past that ended up being pretty influential. There was one on export controls that happened after the first Trump administration put in place export controls on ZTE. These big things can come out of these. They don't always come out like right that second, but it is a very clear indicator of like what are the priorities, what are the top leaders in China thinking about at this moment. And surprise, surprise, what they're thinking about is AI. And according to the official readout, which came out from Chinese state media at the event, Xi Jinping, the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party said, quote, "We must continually strengthen basic research, concentrate resources to overcome challenges in core technologies such as high-end chips and foundational software, and build an independent, controllable, and collaboratively functioning AI foundational hardware and software system." So what that's saying, if you translate it into simple English, is they want to own their own technology stack. They want all Chinese technology, top to bottom. When they say that we must control core technologies, they're basically saying we don't want to be dependent on foreigners for core technologies. And so we must make them indigenously. And then they also had, hearkening back to critical terms, literally from the Maoist era of trade autarky, about self-reliance and self-strengthening, which again, in communist ideology, these are really important terms of art that mean something significant about reducing your reliance on foreign countries and foreign technology. So they've been consistently articulating that. Unsurprisingly, that they're doubling down on that. They've been doing it for basically the entire Xi Jinping regime at this point. One other interesting thing, that came out of here, or actually two interesting things here, is number one, there were some important quotes about promoting the adoption of AI technology. So here's another quote from Xi Jinping. "We must promote deep integration of AI technological innovation and industrial innovation, build a collaborative innovation system driven by enterprises involving industry, academia, research, and application, support the transformation and upgrading of traditional industries, and open up new tracks for the development of strategic emerging industries and future industries." So I think what you're basically seeing is Xi Jinping saying, hey, we need to figure out how we get everybody in all the state-owned enterprises, in all the government agencies, and to the extent that we can, the rest of the economy. And if people don't think it's part of their job to figure out how to use AI in their job, we need to make it clear to them that in fact is. And so this kind of a thing, at this stage, it's like a speech. But this speech, I promise you, is very closely watched by government officials in every Chinese ministry, in all the provinces and all the provincial government officials, and in the leaderships of the state-owned enterprises. And they've already been getting direction, to accelerate their use of AI. And this is, taking that just to one additional level. So if you think about there's who's inventing, who's innovating the most, and then there's also who's actually using that technology to the most meaningful impact. They're going hard on this. The last thing I think that's worth pointing out is there was a really interesting note about international cooperation. So Xi Jinping emphasized, and this is now a quote from the official readout, but not a quote from Xi Jinping himself. Xi Jinping emphasized that AI can become an international public good that benefits all humanity. We must vigorously engage in international cooperation on AI, help global South countries enhance their technological capabilities, and contribute China's efforts towards bridging the global intelligence divide. So here, what you and I have talked about over the past few years, we've been doing this podcast, is how China sort of recognizes that they have a really hard time taking Huawei AI and going to France, right? And saying, hey, France, don't pick NVIDIA, pick Huawei, right? That's a really hard argument to make. But if you go to Nigeria, if you go to Cambodia, these other developing countries, China sort of has more tools in the sales toolbox. And what they're basically saying is we need to go to the global South and help them rise in AI. Number one, because we'll make money, but number two, right, because it's part of our overall geopolitical strategy to succeed there. And maybe we can build, relevant economies of scale, relevant network effects, relevant adoption that ultimately can make us more competitive in the West and other developed countries. But, this is a priority. And it also matters because one of China's key messages throughout the export controls debate is that, hey, America says they're holding back China because we're so bad, but actually they just want to hold everybody back, and we're the first victim. And so you should really be aligning yourself with China. We're going to help you grow. We're not going to, watch you get put in the same position by the Americans that they put us in, which is they say that you can rely on them, and then obviously you can't because they try and pull the rug out from under you. So all really interesting and important messages coming out of top leaders in China so far.
Greg, finally, I want to ask you, what are the implications for U.S. companies and for the United States government?
Yeah, I think if you are American companies, on the one hand, you're kind of familiar with this line of argument because it's been coming out of China for basically more than a decade at this point, right? This you could argue started on the day that Xi Jinping assumed his office in 2012, or you could argue it started with Made in China 2025, which comes in 2015. But, it's just the volume of these kinds of messages keep getting louder. And so when you hear, the Chinese government, we need to build independent, controllable, and collaboratively functioning AI foundational hardware and software system, it's not that you haven't heard versions of that message before, but you have to think about, how that message is being received in China top to bottom. And with the the decibel level of the trade war right now, I'm sure that message is resonating loud and clear throughout China. And I think people understand the direction they're getting from the top.
Greg, as always, terrific insight. This is the top stuff that we need to focus on. Really appreciate your insight today and explaining all this.
I appreciate you taking the time to chat. Thanks, Andrew, as always.
You got it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.